Fighting Through Podcast, Episode 101, The Legacy of D-Day. Also known as Get Off the Beach, Lads. Also known as New Tank Tracks, Coffee and Donuts. More great unpublished history. Hello again, and another warm World War II welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. I'm Paul Cheall, and the aim of this podcast is to share family stories, memoirs, and interviews with veterans from all the countries and all the forces. This is a special bonus episode featuring my recent visit to the Green Howards Museum in Richmond, Yorkshire last week to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day with a discussion amongst World War II enthusiasts. A week ago, I drove up to the delightful town of Richmond in Yorkshire. Up is the operative word, because Richmond, with its rich military history and castle, is built on a hill. And even as I prepare this episode, I recall a dark day many years ago when a van I was driving got stuck on that hill. I was a student doing a summer job, and I was delivering ice creams for an ice cream company. The Ford Transit I was driving felt distinctly underpowered as I struggled up that ancient cobbled hill. I parked outside the shop, halfway up the hill, on the left, to deliver my order. Chalk ices and raspberry mivies duly dropped off, I re-engaged first gear and pulled away. Except I didn't. With the revs up and clutch fully out, I tried to move off, but the van wasn't having any of it. The power just wasn't there. And slowly, ever so slowly, I started rolling backwards towards the huge plate glass window of the shop. I was in control, but the engine just wouldn't comply. I knew what was happening, so I wrenched the handbrake on and held the transit about 6 inches from the glass. I got out and shared my concerns with the proprietor of the establishment, who gathered all the resources he could to help push me off. The lady passing by with her pram, complete with screaming baby. The customer who'd only called in to get a mint choc chip to shove down his mush. And another guy who was only there to read the gas meter. The shop owner himself leaned into the task, all of them joined together in a spirit of comradeship like a fleet of Dunkirk little ships coming to the rescue of our stranded troops. They pushed and pushed while I revved the guts out of the engine, and slowly but surely they waved me off as I disappeared in a cloud of black smoke that would have challenged any gas mask. I struggled home, and next day the boss took the van in for repair because it certainly hadn't been my fault that his strawberry delights nearly didn't get delivered. Apparently the ignition points had come loose. That shop is still there today, and as I drove past at a steady speed in low gear, I admired the huge plate glass window, still there after all this time. I'm sure I could still see my dirty exhaust marks on the bottom corner of the glass. Oh, my word. Anyway, here we are with a discussion between Angus Wallace of the World War II podcast, Steve Erskine, curator and researcher at the Green Howards Museum, and myself, Paul Cheall. All three of us have military connections through our ancestral lines. Steve's father served with the Royal Scots Greys, which he joined in 1938, having previously been part of the International Brigade in Spain. He went on to serve with the SAS and ended his career as Regimental Sergeant Major at Mons Officer Cadet School in Aldershot. He was demobbed from Catterick, hence the family set up home in the northeast, so Steve's got a Scottish father and a Cockney mother, making Steve a real hybrid. Angus is host and producer of the leading WW2 podcast, interviewing a wide variety of war authors. Angus' father was in the Royal Army Service Corps and landed on the Mulberry Harbour in September 44 as part of 30 Corps. The LST door got stuck and his truck had to be winched off. He spent the rest of the war driving between Normandy and Belgium, ferrying supplies in his Studebaker truck. And Angus has other close relatives who fought in wars. I'm Paul Cheall, son of Bill Cheall, whose World War II memoirs have been published by Pen and Sword in Fighting Through, From Dunkirk to Hamburg. My own dad was in the Territorial Army before war was declared and spent the entire war fighting through, all the way from Dunkirk to Hamburg. You know, that could be a good title for a book. So, today we've got three veteran sons coming together to discuss all things D-Day, facts, stats, legacy, beaches, movies, and more beaches. Angus set the ball rolling by asking what the meaning was of the 80th anniversary of D-Day ceremonies taking place all over the world.
Because we've all got different positions on what it means to us. Paul, your dad was there. My dad was a slacker. We didn't get there till September. So it's sort of second-hand and films to me. But obviously, Steve, you're coming in from... It's completely different being at the museum, because is it education? Is it tourism? Is it commemoration? So what does D-Day sort of mean to us? Who wants to start, Paul?
I was thinking about something like this the other day, because it's partly about heroes, partly about commemorating the event. But if you think first and foremost what's it about, it's really commemorating the deaths of all those guys that died. It's not celebrating the survivors necessarily. It's just accepting the fact that a lot of people died, and there's a message coming from it about our future freedoms as much as anything else.
Do you think that's because your dad was there, commemorating the death? Your dad was in one of the early waves, wasn't he? He was at what is the Private Ryan end of D-Day.
He was, yes. I mean, it's coming from that, but also that some of the veterans I've spoken to, that none of them will admit to being a hero. They always said that the heroes are the ones that died. So, you know, if we're commemorating anything, it's a service in the honour of the people who died, really.
That's interesting, because I know my PhD supervisor used to say, well, you've got to remember that Remembrance Day was actually set up to remember those who came home alive. And I thought, I never thought of it that way, because she pointed out poppies were there actually not to remember the dead, remember the dead, and it changes over time.
You know, I think I stand on November the 11th, and when you say, you know, you remember, what do you remember? You take a personal stance on that. And for me, it is the guys and the women who fought. It's that generation from 1900 to 1945 that I think of, with 2 world wars, an economic depression, no welfare safety net underpinning any of that. That is one hell of a generation to have gone through all that. And I think about them, not just men and women who fought the Second World War, but about people who campaigned in workplaces and things like that. Those are the people that my mind turns to when I stand and think about that. The people that I owe a debt to for different things. So Steve Erskine, the person, kind of thinks like that. But Steve Erskine, the museum person, is constantly looking for those nuggets to field those stories. So either, as you said earlier, it's for education, it's for an exhibition, it's for a great story to share. It's trying to capture those things and keep them so that someone will come along and say, I need a story of a paratrooper who did something ridiculous. Aha! I've got one.
The odd thing is, though, we're all of an age where we can touch D-Day. We have relatives that touch D-Day. You know, there's a lot of, my daughter at school, a lot of those parents will be very much further removed. My dad was 50 when I was born, and my daughter was 40 when I was born. So there's a lot of people. It is a thing when they say that the olden days, it is the olden days, and beyond their family remembrance, which makes it. How does that make it difficult at the museum level to actually cater for that?
Yeah, because you're trying to get into the minds of your potential audience. You know what? I think again, one of the things that we are good at, blowing our own trumpets for a moment. We've got that eye for a great story that would move somebody or make somebody laugh or make them think. But we still think in terms of what would I do that would make Paul react? What would I do that would make Angus react? I'm not sure I've got the same wires connecting to a 12-year-old boy or girl who might be doing a D-Day project or whatever. I can't get my head into their mindset as they're approaching the subject, which is one of, again, the things that is great about museum, because what you do is turn around and say, well, I'm not telling you, you come and tell me then.
I think a lot of the history of the stories and everything else, I don't know if the word is age agnostic. I know my listenership goes right across the entire spectrum of age groups. Nearly 50% are less than 45 years old. And I've certainly got some youngsters like who started listening when they were 6, 11, 13 I've got, and they listen with their parents. But, you know, they love it. There's one little girl that's just gone to senior school, private school, to study history because she got enthralled by my podcast. So I think any story works really, no matter what the age group.
Well, I do wonder, well, I mean, we were partly discussing films when we were thinking about what we're chatting about. And I did wonder if how we remember it and what it means to people has shifted over time. Let me illustrate this with 2 films. So if you look at The Longest Day, I mean, it's a long film. It's a great film. It's 1 hour 50 before they get to the beach. It's all about the build-up. It's all about everybody involved, and that's catering for everybody involved. That the theatre-going people at the time will have been there. They'll have been working in the factory. By the time we get to 98, is it Saving Private Ryan? Something like that. It's all about that first 20 minutes. Yes. I bet most of us can't remember what happens in the rest of the film, but it's that first 20 minutes, which shifts the idea of D-Day now. So it's all about the stories, but Private Ryan is very much that story of the little group on the beach, rather than the widespread big picture, which demonstrated to those people at the time what they were doing and how they fitted into it.
I'll tell you what I admired about The Longest Day and the black and white Dunkirk movie. It's just like a linear fashion of how they treated it. It was almost like a history lesson. This is what happened. This is the things we did, and this is how it all worked. Whereas when you look at the modern reiterations of them, it's not made up, it's stylized, but around a true core of historic events, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think word for word, Dunkirk the movie was like, well, this is exactly what happened, and the modern day ones don't do that.
The modern ones tend to be the bottom up view, where we don't need to show you beyond the little group of people. Absolutely. Whereas the older ones tend to give you a more broad picture and I always think it's possibly to explain to. I have a feeling my dad came out of the war and he didn't really know what happened. He didn't know the jigsaw that happened. He knew his part. He knew how certain things had stuck with him. So he was very keen because he'd passed through Villers-Bocage. He knew about Villers-Bocage. He'd gone through Falaise. So he knew about the Falaise Gap. But there's other things I could ask him about that happened in North Australia. We have no idea. And I can't help but think that some of these films then help fill in that picture for people. And you get to The Longest Day, and it really does tick a lot of boxes explaining what had happened to everybody. Apart from the Canadians. The poor Canadians get overlooked.
I have to say, with my green Howard hat on, not the green Howards, because it's The Longest Day, and Stan Norris doesn't even get a mention.
That is odd. And there's 4 Medal of Honour on D-Day as well, and I'm not sure quite how much there.
Do you think that sort of the technology of making films has changed the way we appreciate stuff? Do you think that the kind of almost that innocence and lack of technology for some of the films that we were raised on? I don't know what I'm trying to say. Am I asking a question about how much we engage imagination into these things, rather than just having it in your face with arms flying off and goodness knows what?
Technology enables imagery that just wasn't possible in bygone days, doesn't it?
There's a time when you couldn't manage it. There was a time after the war when we had loads of spare kit to do stuff. And the army were quite happy to lend you it. Then there's probably time from the 60s onwards where the army didn't want to lend you it because it cost them a fortune. So you got a bit Spartan when you used the wrong things.
But there is that cultural thing as well when you're growing up, and I don't know if this appealed to you, but I read a story about Zulu, and that Stanley Baker was the chairman of the Royal Victorian Military Society, and he made sure that all of the detail on those uniforms was completely accurate, and that Colour Sergeant Bourne, the guy with the big mutton chops, he actually wore a white webbing belt from 24th of foot that was at Islandwana in the film. Okay. Now, that's the kind of thing, at the age I discovered, I think, oh, I like that.
Well, that's like Richard Todd wearing his original beret
on Pegasus Bridge reenactment.
What I hadn't realised until I started poking around, Richard Todd lands on D-Day 3 times. He's in 2 D-Day films, and one of them he's talking to, on the longest day, he's talking to himself. He plays Howard talking to Richard Todd, and he obviously lands on the day, which is quite remarkable. He must be, by D-Day, by the longest day must be, oh God, here we go again.
I do think a lot of the modern films get torn apart by the social media fraternity who, it's not snobbery, but it's like, oh, they use the wrong sort of tank track.
My phone is always pinging when something's on the television with my mates going, got the wrong rifle.
Well, it does make you wonder how, when you have actors in sort of 1940, 1950 who had served, what sort of authenticity did they add to something? Did they even care that it wasn't the right thing? Or could those people just say, well, yeah, it's all right. That tank represents it, but I know it's wrong, I'm not worried. And it's only us now, 80 years later, we get caught up with those kind of things. But you got talk about that modern aesthetic. It's interesting that what's deemed as the modern aesthetic for Saving Private Ryan, that first 27 minutes, which is just fantastic. That is from those 9 photographs from Robert Capa on the beach. And it's incredible how they've taken those photographs of, I think he's probably one of the few combat photographers that go in those early waves. He somehow gets himself back out again, doesn't he? And they're the only shots that survive. But it's incredible how they took those stills and visualized them into motion for 27 minutes. And I think that's what sets that film apart. If you think of the previous films, they were very much more, if you look at the Army film unit shots of D-Day, they're very much more, I don't mean staged, the cameras are more fixed. The guys obviously sat sheltered, filming back onto the beach. There's a different stillness to them. Someone scrabbling out of the front of a landing craft, scrabbling around the tank traps and stuff, which you get all that feeling of movement in those Magnum photographs.
But there is also there is footage on the beach, isn't there, where the guys are coming up the beach and 2 men fall.
Yeah.
And you see the round hit the water behind him. Yeah. It's gone through him. And the second guy is hit first, goes down and tries to get up again and then falls again. Yeah. This isn't sensitized in that sense. It's less impactful it's almost a one-dimensional look at it, whereas you get the 3-dimension with new technology. And then you get another recent one, the recent Dunkirk film. I quite enjoyed that. I thought it was a really good film. And one of the reasons I thought it was unusual was the way that he tackled something. One of the things we have today is modern serving soldiers, men and women, and PTSD. Okay? And PTSD is regarded as something that happens to you. Mm-hmm. And in large measure, that is exactly what it was. People are affected by something that happened to them. I think what Dunkirk did in one particular instance, and I remember sitting up and taking notice in the film, is when the ship is sinking and he goes up the ladder and pulls the guy off to escape. He's got PTSD because of what he did rather than something being done to him. And I thought that was an unusual way of approaching that particular facet. Sometimes your victimness is about what you did rather than what happened to you.
I still prefer the John Mills version of Dunkirk.
If it's got John Mills in it, come on, let's face it.
There's a sort of segue from this subject onto another one, which is, have you seen this new series on, I think it's BBC Two, but I think it's called Dunkirk, D-Day Archives or something?
D-Day Tapes Unheard or something like that. I haven't seen it. I'm aware of it, but I haven't seen it.
I saw it the other night. It's a series, but it's really good. I mean, they take interviews from real veterans at the age they were, I don't know when, probably 20 years ago even, but they've superimposed their voices on real actors. So the actors are playing the part of the veteran, like, if you like, shortly after the war finished, talking through what went on. And it just comes across really authentic. The first 5 minutes, you're getting your head around the fact that there's some guys lip-syncing what the veteran's saying, but they really do it well, and the mannerisms, they're acted out really well. So after a short while, you begin to believe that is the person. And then there's a couple of historians knitting it all together, and they're showing archive footage of whatever's happening. And it's a really powerful way of telling history, I think.
And what part of D-Day they're remembering? Because I think this is interesting about D-Day. Because I think we've got more and more myopic about D-Day.
I've only watched the first episode.
Where is their starting point for D-Day? Because I think most people now, when you think of D-Day, as I say, it's 1 hour 50 before the longest day you get to the beaches. Saving Private Ryan starts on the beaches, and I think for most people now, D-Day in the sort of public history, it starts with a Higgins boat bouncing up and down, ready to go off the beach.
It's pretty much, H hour. They do the glider landings at the bridges.
Do you guys look at, because of what you do in terms of your podcasting and the skills that you've got in terms of questioning and trying to tease those details out of people who maybe feel it as a slightly alien environment, start to clam up? Do you watch old interviews? I'm thinking particularly the black and white series about the First World War, where they interviewed those guys.
The Great War.
And then you've got the guys who were interviewed as part of the World at War. And then you've got the more recent series on the Falklands. Can you spot a progression of stylistic creativity or questioning?
The Great War invented the genre. No one had ever thought of making clip documentaries by interviewing people and putting them on the top, and then the World at War takes that a step further, and everyone suddenly went, God, there's a bit of a thing. It's dirt cheap to do. Let's make it. We've been living with it ever since. I guess there is. What's always problematic about that is, though, especially I guess when you talk to the other side, the enemy, is how much are they saying what you want them to say. And then you've also got the thing which is, I always find, I'm sure you've seen this, Paul, when you interview veterans or they start to tell you things that are not part of their story, that they've picked up themselves, because they couldn't have possibly known all these other things. And then they start, well, of course there was. How do you know that? Well.
Because we all do that. I sometimes talk about things. I think, now, do I remember that, or did I see it on a program and I think I remembered it?
Yeah.
But it's interesting that we all know Ken Cook. And when I first met Ken, he told me about, he would say, I'm going off to wherever. And I know they're going to ask me the question. When the ramp went down and he went running off in that moment, what were you thinking? And Kel has probably told you that same story, that he ran through some water. And the only thing he can remember is standing staring at his feet, being really annoyed that he's got wet socks for the rest of the day. Now, that's not what broadcasters want.
No.
And it's difficult when that's the thing he remembers. He's almost apologetic in that, I'm sorry, I don't remember all of this other stuff. I've just got that in my head.
When I do these things, it's more just a conversation. And luckily I've got Dad's memoir, if you like, as an anchor. Yeah. So that if they start talking about tanks in Normandy, then, I've got a little anecdote from Dad's story that I can chip in, or equally I can start off with the story and they react to it. And I do find that drags out their memories. Yeah. But broadly speaking, they've spent the last 80 years remembering this stuff. And they've gone down this channel of what they remember. Yeah. And if you ask them a question, like, what did you do over here? Or, the days after D-Day, what was that like? They haven't got a lot of memory about it. They've either chosen to forget it because it was so horrible, or...
So mundane.
It was so mundane. There was so much of the same thing. It didn't register in their brains.
Mm. Yeah, my dad's memory was most of the war was very, very mundane, and he just sort of a lot of it was wrong. His dates wafted about if you compared them to his war diary. But there was stuff that when I went through his war diary and went, "Do you remember this? There's a bell. What about this? But there was this thing that happened here. Did it? Can't find any records of this thing you're describing. I'm sure it did." He had a story of being bombed at Calais by the RAF, and we used to rib his mate who'd been on Lancasters in the RAF about it. But I can't find any reference to the RAF accidentally bombing Calais, so I'm not quite sure how that all fits in.
Well, again, it's like the Hollis thing, isn't it? Stan took on single-handedly a Tiger tank in the desert, and there's, did the Germans actually have Tiger tanks? Now, if a tank is coming at you with all guns blazing, it don't matter whether it's a Tiger tank or a Mark IV. Identifying it is not the priority.
Yeah.
But again, a story starts to evolve that becomes truth. It's, there are so many things in this museum where we're countering perception that is what happened. We do an awful lot with family history. People come to us and say, Grandad did X. And we do that research and find out that Grandad never left the country. You know, you have to be relatively diplomatic in pricking the bubble, because people hold very sincerely that family legend that's what happened in our family. And sometimes you really are overturning some very, very serious notions of self, down to people's parentage. We've had a 62-year-old woman who came and said, my father was a Green Howard and he was a POW. And when I found his records, he was captured in the first half of 1940, either at Norway or at Dunkirk. And she said, that's not my father then. Why not? I wasn't born till 1943. Mm. And at 62, to discover that the man you thought was your father wasn't your father. Mm. And the story there is that she went round to tell members of her family and said, two of my cousins both said to me, independent of each other, did you not know? Amazing, yeah, it still has that relevance. It still has that capacity to come back after all this time.
There's kind of things that people want to be connected to. If you were first of all, everyone wants their family to have been on the Somme. How could you not?
We're inundated with people who served at D-Day. Can you tell me what he did and where he was?
Well, I was going to say that. Is that one of the box ticks? Even though the Green Howards serve all over the place, is D-Day one of the big box ticks?
And of course, because publicity is coverage, someone will be watching. I think I had a relative who was. I must look that up. And sometimes you find out, yes, they were, and it's a fantastic story. And others, no, he wasn't even in this regiment. You got the badge wrong or whatever, which is quite understandable. There's that word of mouth. Uncle Jack told me he did, so he did.
Do you think sometimes there are misbeliefs about how somebody died as well? Yes. Because one or two of Dad's comrades, I keep a keen eye on what happened to them, and there's one, John Bousfield, who was killed at the Battle of Wadi Akarit. And in Dad's memoir, and my dad never embellished stuff. What I believe every single word of his memoir, insofar as he believed it anyway. John Bousfield was blown up on the plain of Wadi Akarit. Dad had to go home on leave after North Africa and to tell his parents what had happened. But anyway, when I've read in one history book, Singe, which I notice you've got on your desk, Story of the Green Howards, according to Singe, John Bousfield was in the regimental HQ, which took a shell, and he was killed in that. Well, I think the truth was, we don't know what the truth was, but I think what I'm trying to say is, do you think the military authorities sometimes softened the blow on the relatives? Absolutely. They wouldn't tell him he was blown to smithereens. They would tell him he died quickly.
Everyone dies quickly and heroically.
Yeah, I'm sure.
When we were doing the Sicily exhibition, there was one instance there. Forgive me, I can't remember the name of the soldier, but there were two letters, one from the CO and one from the Padre. The CO he died instantly he wouldn't have known and all of this, and the Padre told it like it was. He was hit and he lingered. One of the things you get, particularly First World War, he has no known grave. Why? Now, obviously, the gruesome one is because there was nothing left to bury. High explosive was the killer. But then you've also got that situation where I bury my pal and I know where he's buried and where I buried him, but then I'm killed on the way back and his grave location dies with me. So he was buried, he does have a grave. Or that ground was fought over again in 1918 and where those graves were lost. It's a little less clinical in the Second World War because it's a bigger canvas and it's a much more mobile war. But yeah, you still get, why is he missing?
It's funny you should mention being blown up. I'll share, as you've mentioned it, I'll share this with you now. This is one of my things I brought to share with people tomorrow. Dad had a pal, Arthur Oxley, that he felt he made friends with on Queen Mary travelling to Egypt, 1940, early 43, no, late 42, whatever. After the Battle of Wadi Akarit, Dad was asked by an officer to go and bury one of their comrades because all the stretcher bearers and medics were too busy looking after the wounded. So Dad had a job, bury this body, and he took a pal with him, and the pair of them buried this body, but it wasn't a full body, it was arms and legs and God knows what, and they didn't know who it was, other than the fact that it was a really upsetting experience, except when they came to, I think they found a cap on the floor, and the cap badge was on it. And this is the cap badge that Dad kept. You can see all that twisted from being blown up.
It's a Green Howard cap badge.
Yeah.
It's been well polished.
Do you think?
Well, look at it. The rows, there.
Yes, it's slightly worn.
It's been well polished.
Quite amazing. I did wonder if that was just the...
But the top half of the Princess Alexander's A and the Princess's coronet is all missing on that. So I'm assuming that's impact. So did he know who it was?
Yeah, because he was a pal. So he only knew who he was because they must have found his dog tags as well. Because Dad took one dog tag and gave it to the officer, and they covered the body with a cairn of stones because it was too hard to dig. It was rock hard. And Dad never knew until later on, after the war, whether the body had been recovered, and then he found that it was recovered, and it's in, is it Sfax or Sfax? Sfax. And he's laid to rest in the Sfax cemetery. Yeah, Arthur Oxley.
But again, that's another thing you get when you look at grave registrations on things like Commonwealth war graves. Those will have the original burial spot, and it'll say, reinterred in January 1945. People think, he must have died near here. Yes. Not necessarily, apart from the fact they're concentrating a lot of smaller graves at casualty clearing stations or whatever into the bigger ones. They're also dug up battlefield burial.
There are a lot of mini cemeteries scattered around Normandy, aren't there?
Well, that's just I was going to bring up, because something I've watched Saving Private Ryan, and it starts. Well, I watched it recently. I can qualify that. It starts and ends at the American cemetery at Omaha, and I wonder if actually that has affected our public memory, because everyone expects everyone in that cemetery to have died at Omaha, and they're not. They're brought there, whereas actually the Commonwealth cemeteries are scattered all over Normandy, so that it's much less impactful is our loss, because it's not viewed in one place. So you go to Omaha, and the impression, because the cemetery's there, all these 4,000 or 5,000 people in the cemetery fell at Omaha. And I wondered if that actually has made that Omaha feel more impressive and central to the narrative, which is one reason partly why the Commonwealth landings kind of get overshadowed, because you see those shots in Saving Private Ryan and it shows you all those crosses, and it's very similar to Oh What a Lovely War at the end, when they pull back and there's just thousands and thousands of crosses representing the First World War dead. It's such a similar thing.
Say, you've got somewhere like Thiepval. It doesn't matter how many times I've been to Thiepval and stood there and been round it. The idea that there are 77,000+ names of men who have no known grave. I mean, is it Stalin who said, one death is a tragedy, 6 million is just a statistic? Yeah. It's kind of like that. Yeah. Not out of any sense of callousness. It's just my limited brain can't calculate that there's 77,000 human beings who have nowhere to call a final resting place, but a wall on a memorial. And I don't know, did they learn the lesson of that impact? And that's why they didn't. But again, in recent times, we now have done that with the British Normandy Memorial, in pulling all of those D-Day casualties together in one place on a wall. Not their bodies, not their remains.
It's just impactful, all those.
Oh, absolutely.
Gravestones.
And there's something about the neatness of it as well, the neatness of death in that sense.
And it's partly unusual because the Americans could repatriate their dead. So when they pull them all together, other people who weren't repatriated, and you say ours are sort of scattered around in sort of penny packets, which are lovely. But you see the American one, you go, woo. And because it's overlooking those beaches, you think, oh, this is everyone who died on Omaha. Surely it was bloody Omaha for no reason, and actually forget that our beaches were pretty horrific.
Have you ever been to any of the German cemeteries? So near Omaha, right. Colville-sur-Mer. Not far from there is La Combe, which is one of the big German cemeteries. Well, it's one of the few. And Michael Wittmann's in there, for instance. Oh, yeah. They're very, stylistically, atmospherically, in terms of how you memorialise, are unbelievably stark. Ours are supposedly designed along a sort of a British churchyard, etc. A cemetery isn't a happy place, I'll grant you, but these are really bleak. And then you go to somewhere like Langemarck on the First World War, because I believe the French pretty much said to the Allies, look, guys, we need the land. Can you consolidate all of these little cemeteries into big ones? And then effectively said to the Germans, right, you've got 3 months, do what you like with them, but get them rid. And they pretty much bulldoze them into big pits. So you'll go into somewhere like Langemarck and there's 20,000 bodies in that flower bed, and they've had only recently have they had funding for their version of the Commonwealth war graves to try and put some kind of list of people together.
I wonder if that cemetery overlooking the beach also helps concentrate on the fact that D-Day is that first hour or two where the boats hit the beach and the public history of D-Day doesn't get much beyond the dunes. They're supposed to be getting to Calais the first day. They're arriving push bikes to cycle there. But actually, it's all about getting over the beach. And actually, for most people, D-Day was not jumping off landing craft into a hail of gunfire. All right, they were under fire.
But you've also got that thing where the physical evidence is right down where it is. When you get inland, it's more of a field, it's more of a place. Whereas you haven't got that physical. If you go to Arromanches, you've got the Mulberry Harbours, you've got the Fleury Battery at Vers-sur-Mer. As you say, you've got the cemetery, you've got all those pillboxes in the bluffs above Omaha. You look at Pont de Hoc. All of that physical evidence is there to reinforce it in your mind that this is what happened, and it's connected to those white headstones over there.
I was listening to Paul Woodage in a way here, and he pointed out that some of the barbed wire at Pont de Hoc is a leftover from The Longest Day. It's not the German wire at all. And it's in the wrong places because they didn't put it on the cliffside. It was on the other side to protect from a land attack.
I went to the World War II D-Day commemoration display at Duxford the other day in the museum where all the hardware is, the tanks and God knows what. They got, make-believe setups with the guns and what have you, covered in barbed wire. And when you first look at it, you think, oh, God, that looks sharp. But when you touch it, it's all rubberized. It's all plastic, basically.
Yeah, health and safety.
I know people hurt themselves. It's the Blackadder thing. Watch it, see.
How much of your dad's book concentrates on just the beach? How quickly does he cover the beach?
Oh, gosh.
2 pages? 5 pages? I bet it's not much.
5 chapters.
What, just on the beach? Just that moment where he hits the sand and gets to the dunes. I did mean to put it off the shelf and have a read.
Are you telling me you haven't read it yet?
I have read it. I have read it. I haven't read it for a long time.
To answer your question, he starts off with pre-D-Day training because he has to go up to Scotland for some training. And then he gets wounded on the 30th of June. So he's only got 3 weeks to cover.
But my point being, if we're just focusing on the beach, I bet your dad covers that short bit on the beach relatively quickly because, as you say, D-Day to your dad is the build-up and into June afterwards. But now I think the concentration is just to do, they've crossed the beach. Right, what's next? Bridge too far.
If you include being on the Empire lands going over the Channel and then getting into a landing craft and travelling from on the landing craft to the beach, then crossing the beach, getting beyond the beach, I'm pretty sure he's got 4 or 5 chapters.
Because I don't think people are even particularly talk much about how you got into the landing craft.
No. And it's also that fact, and I tell people, listen, they look at me, no, that can't be right. And you know this. You get down your scramble net, you get in the first lot, off that one goes, then the second one comes in, then the third one. Meanwhile, number one is still going round in circles for nearly 2 hours till everybody's ready to go in together. And then you've got 7 miles at however fast one of them goes. My God.
I think there's sort of a hand-waving expectation that these people bobbed across in the landing craft because the Channel's not, because it's not far to France. We're not crossing at Calais, we're a lot further south. But they just bobbed across and then they all landed on the beach. And we have a Saving Private Ryan moment for 30 minutes. And that's D-Day done. And they never, the conversation never gets beyond it. So it'd be interesting to see next week. I bet there's no conversation about the Battle of the Bocage. We're not interested in that. No, that's grim, dirty stuff. It's the beach. It's all the focus is the.
And it is. They got in the landing craft and went in. No. But again, do you think that some of that is because, and I say this carefully, it's almost as if the beach was relatively easy. We got through that first crust of the defence because the Germans had placed their battalions that were not their first line troops, so it was relatively easy to get there. It wasn't until they'd realised this is the real thing and got organised that's when D-Day starts in effect.
But I think for the public, from a news cycle perspective, it's they've crossed the beach, we've liberated France. That's it. It doesn't take long after that. Another 9 months and we're all done.
And to be fair towards the Green Hounds Museum, when we were very conscious of that when we did the exhibition. So the 4 galleries are broken down. There's the air element on the night of the 5th or 6th. Then we do the beach. Then we do bocage. And then we do breakout. Yeah. So the 4 elements of that campaign. We're starting, obviously, because this is a business, thinking of, well, what's next? And we're talking about Normandy to the Elbe. So if you say Holland, everybody says, bridge too far. Yeah. What about all the other stuff? Whether it's clearing the Scheldt estuary so you can get to Antwerp, whether it's Geelen crossing the Albert Canal, there's a lot going on that doesn't get into the public consciousness. No, it doesn't. Because the big headlines win out.
Well, I do wonder, this comes back to, though, again, I had it in my head that we don't talk about the breakout, partly because from the British perspective, you have Monty's, Epsom, Goodwood, all those horse racing operations that he organises, that he then says, we were meant to be just Anvil for the Americans to break out, and I'm not sure, though. I think that's Monty rewriting his own history. But it's not very interesting that we're not getting very far very fast. We've had this wonderful success of making a bridgehead. We're getting supplies across so fast that we can't get them off the beaches. It's just unbelievable. But actually, the rest of it suddenly hits a bit of a snag. And until you get sort of that American breakout, and I think possibly from the British perspective, it was a bit of a, your dad thought about it, but it was a bit of a kind of anticlimax that the Americans had still shown to do that romp.
Yeah, Dad always bemoaned the fact that the Green Howards did all the hard work. Whether it was, didn't matter which part of the war it was, but they always seemed to almost get there waiting to fly the triumphant banner that they'd done it, and then they got withdrawn for something else, and somebody else swept up at the end. Yeah. He was always disappointed in that.
Where's the film about the bocage? Where's the film about Epsom and? Well,
there's just so many things now. I mean, it fascinates me. Just to go back, you mentioned supplies. I wish I'd been at the meeting when someone said, "Look, we need one of the priorities of where we're going to invade. We need a port. Obviously, if we go in Calais, we've got lots of ports, but it's really heavily defended. If we go in Normandy, there's effectively one port, which is Cherbourg, and by the time we've taken it, the Germans are going to blow it up, and we need a port to land all these supplies to keep the momentum of the going." And somebody at the meeting had the confidence to put their hand up and say, "Well, if we can't capture a port, why don't we take one with us?" No. It is a ridiculous notion on the sense of it, but that's exactly what they did. Now, I think that's a great management thing as well, that somebody had the confidence to say something that on the face of it could have been panned, but whoever that person wasn't feeling that's the end of my career because it's ridiculous.
They probably didn't do it in a room full of people. They probably did it one-to-one with Winston.
But this comes down to the D-Day story, where I think we not necessarily miss a trick, but I think actually the beach bit, the boring bit. Sorry to your dad, Paul, but I think the actually all the nuts and bolts for the build-up and the logistics are absolutely mind-blowing, fascinating, and the more people, when you start to explain people about the whole villages in the south of England are evacuated, and you go to see those Tyneham, the village that was evacuated in Dorset, and they're never put back. You start to think about the scale of these things, and you start to talk about put a pipeline in from Southampton and Pluto, and people just can't get their head around these sort of things, how that all worked. And we sort of came up with ration bags. And people don't realise that scale. You say, and do you know how many people we had? We had 100,000 people on the beach within,
But I don't think that generation who was there necessarily. My dad told me the story when they were in Italy. He was in Royal Scots Greys. He was in tanks, and they were told to take the tank to an American base to have it retuned and all of this kind of thing. He said, and we pulled into this base, and there was a long line of tents and good prefabricated huts and all this. He said, and we got out, and this American guy with a clipboard told us to go in this tent and have some breakfast. And then in a couple of hours, go to the top of this place and the tank would be waiting for us. He said, and we went in and we'd never seen eggs and coffee and this stuff for breakfast. We couldn't believe it. Yeah. So we had our fill of this, about 3 goes around. He said, and at the end, we're standing at the top. And this American guy they'd met at the start come walking past with his clipboard. And he said, what are you guys still doing here? They said, we're still waiting for our tank. He went, that's it there. He said it had been retuned, rearmed, re-strung on the tracks, repainted. He said, that's why we won the war. Because they had a Henry Ford system there in the theatre to do all of that.
And my dad remembered driving convoys and said it was always nice when we had to stop at the American stops because they had coffee and they had donuts and they had all this food that we never had. Yeah. And he had a similar story about them from that point of view. I never asked him about how he got his truck serviced. But he had an American truck, he had a Studebaker, which he liked because he didn't like the Bedford. He said it just felt a bit, so we ended up, well, He said we ended up just pushing them off the harbour somewhere, but I can't believe that's true. So, I mean, we've done a lot of talk about what we remember about D-Day. And what do we do? I mean, I was pointing out the logistics of this. Why do we choose to forget if we reverse that argument? Because why doesn't Stan Hollis and his VC get a mention? Why is he not in The Longest Day? Why, there's all kinds of stuff that doesn't seem to appear in the commemoration at the moment as it's building up. We're recording this. The 5th today, isn't it? But it's notable what's missing.
Was The Longest Day an American production or British?
American producer. There's a British director, American director, and the British director directed the British, the American director American, and I'm not sure who the third director was. It does try to do both sides.
Was the focus on collective heroism rather than the actions of one man? And it was The Longest Day not the Stan Hollis story? I don't know.
Well, I think it's got people slotted into the story, hasn't it? But he's not one of the slots.
But they tend to be it's very much the top-down approach, though, isn't it? It's if you're an officer, you're in it. If you weren't an officer, chances are you're some weird character actor like Sean Connery, but he's playing an Irishman or something completely bizarre.
Because Kenneth Moore was the Beachmaster.
Yeah, and he's great, but he's hardly in it at all. But you remember his part, and he whacks the front of the universal carrier. My grandma used to say, if it doesn't work, just hit it, and then suddenly it jumps into life. John Wayne's a bit weird in it, but anyway, there's so much. It's actually a pleasure to watch again. It was such a great film.
One of my favourite quiz questions is, who wrote the screenplay for The Dam Busters?
Stephen Fry wrote the screenplay for the latest version of The Dam Busters.
But the one we all know and were raised on every Sunday afternoon. Go on.
It was.
Go on.
He writes the First World War film. The First World War. God, it's. No, he writes the
Journey's End.
Journey's End. He writes R.C. Sheriff.
Yeah, and people go, really?
Yeah.
But he's an anti-war guy, is he?
No, he's not.
He argued he wasn't.
No.
This is about human endurance.
Yeah.
So is Journey's End. And I wonder if there's something about the quality of the writer. And I understand The Longest Day as well. It was kind of written, and then all these actors came and said, I want a part.
Yeah.
And they kind of wrote it post.
And it's written by Corelli Barnett, wrote it, or had a hand in writing. It's based on his book, which is, 59? Yeah. And he is then interviewing people straight after the war, within 10, 15 years.
Corelli Barnett, for that film, sent questionnaires to an awful lot of people because we found in an archive in a university, I think in Utah, a questionnaire for a Green Howard who'd been asked by Corelli Barnett, where were you, what you were doing, who you were by side and all this. So he was really attempting to get that level of detail.
Yeah.
But again, we're sitting here saying Stan Hollis wasn't mentioned. We don't know if he just didn't make the cutting.
But it's interesting that he gets a mention now. Yeah. I mean, he's been on all over the place. My mum was telling me, did you know there's a guy called Stan Hollis from the Green Howards?
We've had so many calls from people.
Yes, I do know this about Stan Hollis. Yeah, but it's funny that she's nearly 90. She didn't necessarily know the Stan Hollis story. And you think, well, it's interesting. It's come up now. Why was he forgotten? And we were talking before how you said there's a new book out, but there's only been one biography of Stan, which I find quite surprising. There hasn't been a number of them.
And is that because he was just such a modest man anyway? There's very little to write about.
But I think you could write around him and write around what they were doing and have an absolutely cracking book. Oh. And you could filter in things from other memoirs like your dad's that would really add colour to the Stan Hollis story. Because actually, the biography of him, when you read it, what he gets his VC for is not particularly colourfully written. It's gripping, but it could be so much more by filling it in with other... But
again, as you say, you fill it in with those other fantastic stories, the shooting up of the bus stop, or, the issuing of 200 prophylactics to the troops beforehand. And, all of those stories are just part and parcel of that weft and weave of a story.
But they're almost like we've forgotten that, and we're sort of remembering the small individual stories, which comes back to that Private Ryan history of the war. We want the little man on the beach. We're not really interested in the grand sweep of the... But could that be because we're 80 years on? In 1915, were people looking back to Waterloo, go, well, at Waterloo, or are we so far away now that up to a point, some of the larger history, the sort of almost the political history, doesn't matter to people?
It's interesting. We have a gallery that covers Northern Ireland. Now, when I was growing up, and forgive me for insulting your yourselves if you may be of a similar generation where that led the news every single night. Okay? And I find it very strange, and I'm not insulting anybody, it's just because I did, that I'm talking to people, and when I'm saying this is, well, what's that about? It's history now, because it's not in consciousness. We talk about the First World War being history because there's nobody alive who participated in it. And we're getting near to that with the Second World War. There's plenty of guys alive who were in Northern Ireland, but for a great majority of people, it's history because I have no conception of it. To come back to where we kind of started the conversation, is that my job as a museum person? To bolster that information so that people do not necessarily remember it, they can't, but they're aware that there's something here that is informing how this society is, how we view Irish republicanism, how we view Ireland as a nation, how we view where we are now, not in the European Union when they are, etc., etc.
From your point of view, it must be incredibly difficult to juggle entertainment, information, and curation of memorabilia, because there are three very different jobs, and if you drop the ball on any one of them, you fail on all three.
We were talking actually this afternoon about whether or not we're getting a sense, and it may be unfair to ourselves, but we start to worry, are we cheapening Stan Hollis's Victoria Cross by kind of touting it everywhere? Do you know what I mean? You start to feel, am I overplaying this? But I want the story out there.
I think to a degree you've got to play to your audience, because fundamentally you're a business, aren't you? And if you produce a product that people just aren't interested in, then you'll end up having to close. So to me, you've got to champion the cause of what is of most interest to people without completely taking your eye off the ball of other areas of history.
And again, that's what we thought with this exhibition. Clearly Stan Hollis is front and centre, but we were always aware that there were so many stories that lived in the shadow of that one story, and that's what we wanted to bring out in this exhibition, is those people on the undercard, if you like. Their stories have been lost as a consequence, because people's attention wants to be about Stan Hollis and not the Tom Tatesons or the Frederick Lockton of this world.
I mean, if you lead with the headline stuff, the way our minds are working earlier on, you start going down a rabbit hole, and then you want to learn a bit more about that rabbit hole, and then you end up in this huge, great Grand Canyon, and oh wow, you've still got to service the Grand Canyon ultimately, but the easiest way to get people down the rabbit hole is
take them with something they recognise first off.
But arguably, until relatively recent, they recognise Victoria Cross. And they go, no, don't put the Victoria Cross. These two go together. Stan Hollis, Victoria Cross. Oh, okay.
We do get a lot of people, it's surprising, you walk them into the rental room and you show them the cabinet with 14 Victoria Crosses and they ask which one is the Victoria Cross.
Do you think Stan Hollis was, I don't want to diminish the success of what he did, but do you think he was preordained to getting a VC on that day? Do you think?
It's interesting because we've had people say, well, it's propaganda, wasn't it? They had to give it to somebody, and it was him.
They might have given more then if you had.
That is my argument. If it's only propaganda, there would have been more.
And they tend to give more Victoria Crosses when it goes badly. If something goes bad, they give the Victoria. Look, they scatter them out. If it's going well, you don't win one.
Yeah, good point. Was he preordained?
Or maybe it's like having a centre forward that you think, well, if anyone's going to get the goal for us tomorrow, it's going to be him.
Well, I think if we had people that served alongside him, and you said, here's 10 bob, which one of you is going to get it? They'd have said, oh, it's him. It's definitely him. Yeah. And not because he was a loon and not because he was rash and impetuous, but because they picked up on those qualities that he had. I know it's kind of hindsight, but yeah, he's the guy who was going to get it if anybody was. Well, we like our heroes humble as well, don't we? I love that quote when someone asked him, what was the highlight of your military career? And he said, it was when I was made Company Sergeant Major. Not the VC, when I made Company Sergeant Major. Why? Because now I was a big man in Middlesbrough. Brilliant. Says a lot about him.
Well, it says a lot about his service. He's not, although he was a territorial before the war, he's not a professional soldier. He's going home.
And again, we did a thing the other day, and I think one of the things that came out in the television bit that we did was that I truly believe he had a massive sense of his own responsibility for the lives of his men. There's the great story of Padre Lovegrove, the Padre of 6th Battalion, who was in a casualty clearing station. and he saw Hollis walk in with a couple of wounded guys. And he said, I went over to just say hi to Stan, how's it going? He said, and as I approached him, he just collapsed in my arm in tears because the sight of so many of the guys he had responsibility for, that he would have said, right, lads, listen to me, I'll get you home.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll get you back. And he had no control. They were dropping. And he was taking that as a personal loss to him. And I think if you serve with somebody like that, that must be, it must be a comfort to look up and say, oh, it's all right, Stan's here.
This might take us back to the beaches, but we
can't get off the beaches. We've been stuck on the beaches longer than the first wave.
Send supplies.
I always remember the words of Dad's commanding officer, Captain Lynn. He was urging the troops off the beach. He was standing behind a tank. I think it was a broken down Sherman on Gold Beach, and he was saying to the lads, off the beach, off the beach, off the bloody beach, lads, and give the buggers hell. And then he was shot.
He was shot, and then he was seen. He sat up and continued to urge the men forward, and then was hit a second time.
I don't know why I said that story. It was just came into my mind.
Well, there's the other one as well. I think Hollis recounts it, where and he doesn't name it, but he said, I found myself next to an Irish soldier. He said, and as we sat there with everything going on our knees behind this, I think it was a concrete wall with some barbed wire. And he said this bird just came along and started walking along the barbed wire. And the Irish guy said to him, Jesus Christ, even the birds are walking. There's not enough room for the birds, even they're walking.
Too dangerous up in the air. Yeah. I've got some rough figures here for casualties on the beaches. I've got Gold's around about 1,000, same for Sword, 2,500 for Utah, for Omaha. I think Utah was in the low hundreds, wasn't it?
I got 197.
Okay, and Juneau
961. I have around 1,000.
So that's about 1,000. So give or take, they're all around about 1,000 figure.
Well, we had the Green Howards on the 6th of June had 29 killed.
I didn't know that. 29.
On the 6th of June alone, had 29 killed. And by the 30th of August, it was 266.
So, but here's one for you. Do you know how many French died?
On D-Day.
Well, I've got civilian deaths, including D-Day +1. 3,000 French. So more French die on D-Day and D-Day +1 than are on Omaha.
Before you even get to Caen and the levelling of that.
So the French are not, other than the bloke with his, in the longest day with his wine and...
Well, you had the Kiefer commando at Ouistreham. They were French, weren't they?
I don't know, I just picture the guy for the longest day with his wine and his baguettes.
Fireman's helmet on.
Fireman's helmet on. They're all kind of overlooked, so the French civilians. And I have 1,000 German deaths for D-Day plus D-Day +1. But I guess there was fewer of them, and they pull back, don't they? Which obviously is going to become the problem for D-Day. But at which point, when does D-Day finish? Is D-Day midnight on the 6th, or is actually? Because it's interesting how we keep referring to it as
Normandy campaign is regarded as having finished on the 30th of August.
But D-Day itself would have been midnight on the 6th, wouldn't it?
I don't know, but we used to call it D-Day +1, D-Day +2. I don't know why we stopped talking about D-Day +1.
I think it's just to give us an anchor of how far we're talking.
I mean, there's a generic term for the whole thing to it sometimes.
I know it is, but this comes down to what I was sort of thinking about. To most people, D-Day is that 2 hour, 1 hour, 2 hour stretch of just on wet feet to dunes, and then it finishes. It is a 24-hour period, and then +1, +2. And increasingly it gets thinner to claim it's still D-Day.
I've seen a few memoirs which end where the soldiers decided that D-Day is at the end and he's survived and he's putting his head down for the night for a fitful sleep and he says his prayers. Yeah. And I think that to me is the end of the D1, if you like. Yeah. But what I was talking about with the numbers that were killed was really, do you think some of the beaches, broadly speaking, it seems to me they were all a similar difficulty, and there were awful areas and there were probably easy areas, but all things considered, they were all pretty damned awful for the soldiers that had to land on them. Do you think that's fair?
But I think you can nuance that further, though, because it was all pretty awful for those men on the first hour, possibly two. But for most of those tens of thousands that land the rest of the day, D-Day was... all right, they're under intermittent shell fire, but it wasn't that Private Ryan, Under Fire. D-Day is very much that small sliver of time that your dad went through.
We are confident that we have a message going from the beach, Gold Beach, back to the ships to relay to London that the Green Howards have cleared their beach in 49 minutes from the first boot hit.
It was 49 minutes. And then
so they've cleared the beach defences. Yeah. Now they're getting up to that's still, you've got the Mervey Ridge, the minefields, and then you're getting into Vers-sur-Mer. But you've cleared your beach obstacles. And again, it's interesting, the bocage always struck me. The creative minds that came up, as we mentioned earlier, with the Mulberry Harbours, get stuck on the bocage. But why? It didn't grow up on the 5th. Everybody knew it was there. What happened? And the answer that I seem to be getting is because we just were concentrating on the beach. If you can't get off the beach, there is no campaign. So everything has to be on the beach. Once we get clear of the beach, then we'll think about what we've got to do.
Well, I think there's a huge over-optimism in the belief that once we've taken the beach, how hard can it be? We've got bicycles, we've got to cycle to Calne. And that all people go, Calne was we put it in the order, it was a stretch thing that we were going to get to. No, I genuinely think that they thought they were going to be able to get to Calne under the firepower that we have.
I spoke to one prominent historian who said, well, we just didn't think the Germans would use it as a defensive thing. Really?
I just think we underestimated the Germans and their ability to manage chaos was superior to ours.
But it's interesting. The battalion commander of the 7th Battalion said we all of our training was the beach. Yeah. We did nothing about fire and movement once you got clear. We did nothing at company and platoon level. It was all about that.
Actually, for the men that we get ashore, casualties are not that great.
Given what they were thinking they were going to get,
it's a remarkable success.
Because didn't Tedder? He was a bit of a doomsayer, and he thought they were going to take some 25% casualties, not 10. Yeah. And he send a cable to Ike and say, never has a senior officer been more pleased to be wrong.
It's interesting that there's only 29 Green Howards actually
on the 6th of June
on
itself.
The beach. Because in Dad's memoir, he says...
Well, again, the beach, inland, Vers-sur-Mer.
No, on the beach, one of his observations on landing was that dead and wounded lads were lying all over the beach.
But maybe they weren't dead.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it means that, a proportion were dead, but a lot were just wounded and put out of action.
Or a lot had just hit the beach because there was shit flying everywhere.
Just in case we get off the beaches in a minute. Another thing that I keep hearing about when on Omaha in particular, the bombers all over really the bombers and the artillery were supposed to have taken all these pillboxes and gun emplacements out
and created the beach for giving them shelter,
and they failed miserably, didn't they? Really, and why was that? What was it?
And it isn't just there. Everybody talks about again Fleury Battery at Vers-sur-Mer, where Hollis's first action was. But just a little further inland, there's another bunker complex, Saint-Marie-Fontaine, and I've got pictures of that being hit by fire from HMS Belfast. And they dropped something like 206 shells on this thing. Didn't hit one of the casements. Not one of them. Scratched a couple, but never hit one of them. And the 7th Battalion effectively walked up to the site and found these Germans just staggering around all over the place from the reverberations and the percussion. But no, they didn't hit a damn thing. And again, it's that thing about strategic bombing, isn't it? I think I read somewhere like 5% of bombs landed within 13 miles of their intended target. So to hit one pillbox from however high. But then again, you read about, we're under fire from this 88 and a Corvette or whatever comes in close and takes it out. And effectively, it was sea firepower that was the factor in Salerno, for instance. Yeah. Without that, they'd have been pushed back into the sea.
My favourite little factoid of the whole thing is it Longsure-Mer where there's those big batteries behind Sword? Yeah. And one of them's really knackered, and it took a direct hit from HMS Ajax from 4 miles away. Is it 4 miles? And I just think, wow, 4 miles, and it's like bullseye.
Incredible. You look how far 4 miles away and you think, how the hell can you see that?
Well, it's the glider at Pegasus Bridge, isn't it, that nudges the fence.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, wow, what a feat of airmanship. It's interesting how, whether it's memorialisation, our understanding of history through family legend or museum interpretation, we start to get, well, that's what happened.
Well, this is where it gets fixed. We almost have that Blackadder moment where the First World War can be summed up by Blackadder. And no, Blackadder is talking about tropes, but those tropes have become fact. And this is where I think in the Second World War, the same thing is starting to happen. Some of the tropes have become, no, it is like that. No, it wasn't. Yeah. And now that's how it's portrayed in the media. But it's much more nuanced and much more complicated. And a previous generation would have known that because they've grown up with it.
And it's how you look, again, to do the First World War analogy thing. The First World War is perceived through the war poets. Their perspective on it is what is residing in public memory. Because there are a lot of programs that love that imagery.
That's the English department teaching history.
Exactly, and you try not to succumb to that when you're doing the interpretation of the Second World War.
Yeah.
Because guys were taken out of the line; they weren't there forever. You know, there was rotation, and there was an attempt, at least, to try and square peg, square holes, and husband the lives of your men, not in the way that it's perceived at. Bunder-headed Bertie from public school simply went over the top with his men and didn't give
it. It does make you wonder in another 20 years' time when we're looking at the 100 years of the Second World War, will it be as full as much nonsense as we read about the First World War? And the public won't be shifted from their perception of the First World War. However much you say, all this stuff you think is right is wrong. And you can see it happening now, you know. The Battle of Britain, it was the pivotal point where we couldn't, and then people now point out, well, actually, we couldn't have lost it. We had so many planes and so many pilots, but actually, it doesn't fit the narrative of.
And it's also Britain. That narrative isn't there. The one that really, really annoys me, because of course we stood alone in 1940.
Yes, I like this.
Okay, it's us Canadians, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians, Free French, Poles, Czechs, etc., etc.
The rest of the empire.
Yeah, and the highest scoring squadron in the Battle of Britain, 303 Squadron, was Polish. You know, yeah. So it's all part, whether it's a political narrative, whether it's a history narrative or a social narrative. There is a danger that you start to believe the previous story.
Have you seen that documentary? I think it's called From D-Day to Berlin, and it's a US Army cameraman. So the US Army only used 35mm black and white film. The Marines in the Pacific used 16mm colour film because they thought it was more impactful. The Army wanted the quality. So anyway, this Army cameraman shoots his own home movies from D-Day to Berlin in colour 16mm. And it's some of the only colour film from Normandy. Probably in the late 90s.
Because there's a snap of there's some colour footage of Omaha going in, isn't there? You can see him going up the beach. It's only about 4 or 5 seconds, but you see all of that.
It's just a completely different way of viewing it. And those, there'll be little hand crank, clockwork cameras, and off you go, and smaller film.
There's also the thing about them. We don't watch stuff that other nations watch. I can remember standing there. I was at the museum at Arromanches to go in and watch the film in the 360-degree cinema they've got there. And while we were waiting in the queue to go in, there were televisions and they were showing black and white documentary film. And I think there were 5 of us had gone on this trip. We were standing watching it. And there was a tank that had been hit. It was a Sherman tank had been hit. And there were 2 guys on the top. And they pulled a body out of the top. And as they lifted it, this guy had been split in half. And as they lifted him, his body came apart. And all 5 of us went, bloody hell. You would never have shown that here. No. I've never seen it anywhere else but that footage in that museum. And again, if there is some kind of...
And who filmed that? Was that?
I don't know, because we kind of walked in halfway through and weren't there when it ended. But to see that, it was unbelievably shocking. Mm. And again, used to go to Hill 60 in the First World War, and when you went into what was the old museum there, they had a number of what the Butler saw machines.
Yes.
And they were all images from the First World War. Bodies in trees with the guts hanging out.
Yeah.
And we'd stand there and be highly amused that there were skill groups going in there going, bloody hell, sir, look at this. But again, they showed it, we don't.
Yeah, and there must be a lot of it. So you read the memoirs, I can't forget. It's one of the, I think it's one of the D-Day books talks about one of the Padres clearing out tanks, washing them out because basically he describes the remnants looking like jam inside the tank.
Often I've seen accounts of guys who, we were given a tank, and when we went in, there was fingers down there and there was an ear over there.
Well, for how long's your dad in Normandy? Did your dad he's injured, isn't he?
Yeah, he was wounded 30th of June, and then he got taken back to England for recuperation and restoration. And then, I don't know, a month before the war ended, he came back over to Belgium, and then he ended up with the First Lancs just as the war, just as the Germans surrendered, and he ended up in the Mayor of Hamburg's house in headquarters company with the First East Lancs. So he was there right from the start till right to the end, really.
But that his D-Day sort of essentially, or if you want to stretch it that far, just gets you to the end of June, but he gets off the beaches. Yeah. How far inland did he get on the first day?
He got to
it's just south of Coulomb.
Was it? Is that just past Crepon, more or less?
It's a bit further on. It's the objective for D-Day was to cut the Bayeux-Caen road, and they were just short of that. And it is one of the things the Green Howards insist on, and obviously there is a parochialism involved here, but they are reputed to be the furthest inland of any Allied unit at the end of D-Day.
There we go. So we're off the beaches. At least we've got off the beaches. Yeah. Whilst D-Day commemoration might remain on the beaches, and it will be centred on the beaches.
Psychologically and emotionally.
We've psychologically got beyond the beaches.
Go to the pub now, come on.
And there we have it. And the beer was very nice. The following day I spent at the museum was a special one, with guests being shown around the museum exhibits and storeroom, and we had a chance to touch and feel some of the items from the war, including some Tommy helmets and Lee Enfield rifles, and I even did a short presentation on my dad's bayonet, which he'd given to the museum. We were also treated to an excellent presentation from Steve about the Green Howards' role on D-Day, and the day culminated in a special showing of the Victoria Cross Medal won by Sergeant Major Stan Hollis. Behind locked doors, we were allowed to handle the complete medal set and take photographs of what was the only VC awarded by the British on D-Day. It's funny, but the medal was actually very understated in appearance, with a simple cross and a dark purple ribbon, and I guess that's all that was felt necessary. It's the story behind the medal that carries its glory, not the appearance of it. Stan's exploits have been covered before in this podcast and others, so I'm not going to go into details now, but you can listen to a discussion about Stan Hollis between Angus and Steve on the WW2 Podcast, episode 214. That's 214. And I've put some photographs of the museum visit in the show notes, and the Green Howards Museum D-Day exhibition is on throughout the summer and is well worth a visit. The ancient church venue is fantastic, the staff are lovely, and Richmond town and castle as a tourist location are great. As my dad found out in 1942 as he served his officer his breakfast, the usual Cheall of whiskey. Thank you so very much for your support and for making the time to listen to me, and on this occasion Angus and Steve. Thank you guys, and please follow the show in the app of your choice if you want to help me get up those rankings. This was supposed to be the 10th anniversary episode, but events have overtaken me, and now, fingers crossed, episode 102 will be the anniversary episode. Please do hear me next time for my anniversary show, when the usual format of family stories, feedback and PSs, etc. will be back, and I've got some great fresh material to share with you. It's just going to be superb. I'm Paul Cheall saying bye-bye now.